we're going to build a constellation of smaller satellites. Each one generates power and then transmits that power down to the ground. Instead of using sort of a phased array of point antennas that use microwave radiation or radio waves, we want to use beams of infrared lasers. And the benefits of this are you make everything smaller. So by using lasers for power transmission, we actually can get a much smaller spot on the ground.
Welcome to The Peel. I'm your host, Turner Novak, founder of Banana Capital. Today's guest is Baiju Bhatt. You're probably familiar with his work as the co-founder of Robinhood, but he's also obsessed with space and recently started Aetherflux, a space solar power company.
How do you power humanity, cities, states, nations, the whole world? That's like the big, broad ambition.
We get into the physics of space solar power and the roadmap for the first tests later this year.
Those are the places where it's hardest to get fuel. It's the most dangerous, where what we're building we think has some pretty inherent advantages.
Baiju shares how he went from 0 to 1 building physical products.
I built a car.
How Robinhood first got started.
A lot of people of our generation were like, the system's broken, tear it down. There's another path here, which is that you actually make it so that everybody can be a part of it.
Getting turned down by hundreds of investors, raising the seed round.
When we were at the pits of not being able to raise any money, and we went and met with Tim Draper, and he's like, great idea, it's never gonna work. And he's like, how much are you paying yourselves?
We go inside Robinhood's accidental launch.
And we're like, oh my God, I think we just announced our product somewhat inadvertently. This was on like a Friday afternoon.
How to know if you really have product market fit.
If you don't have product market fit and you've never seen it before, it's sometimes difficult to know that you don't have it.
How Aaron Levie, a box, helped get Robinhood.com, the value of creativity and design in a startup, and Baiju's philosophies on combining qualitative and quantitative user research.
And the questions you didn't ask, some of those might be more important than the questions you did ask.
Before we talk to Baiju, I publish new episodes of The Peel every week, exploring the world's greatest startup stories. Check the show notes for more on the topics we discuss, comment on Spotify and YouTube, share this with a friend, explore other episodes, and subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Let's talk to Baiju. Baiju, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about two probably big topics. We're going to talk Robinhood, which founded that, spent a long time. Starting something new though now.
That's right.
It's called Aetherflux.
Yep.
What is that?
Yeah, Aetherflux, new company I'm starting. Mission of the company is to try to do something pretty bold, to take this old idea from the pages of science fiction and to make this thing a reality. So the idea is to find the path to make space solar power a reality. So what is space solar power? It's this old idea from the 1970s. Actually, arguably from the 1940s, there's an old Isaac Asimov story that first sort of talked about this idea. But the concept in the 1970s were, what are the emergent sort of like energy methods of sort of generating energy that we think are going to be relevant for the next generation of humanity? And so the ideas that kind of came out of that were things like fusion and space solar power. And so what space solar power as an idea is what if instead of collecting solar power on the surface of the Earth, you were to collect that in space?
Why is that a big deal?
The benefits of this, the original concept was you would build one monolithic array in geostationary orbit. So pretty far from the surface of the Earth, about 1/10 of the way to the moon. And there you would build one monolithic array, which would face the sun and collect solar power. And when it collects that solar power, it turns it into another form of or sort of photons. So in this case, microwaves. So like think the sort of kind of electromagnetic radiation that we use for telecommunications, and pushing a beam of that through the atmosphere to a ground station to collect power. Now, this is a very cool idea. And the benefits of this would be, if you're in geostationary, at least you'd be like nearly continuously sun facing. And so you would be able to address one of the main problems with solar power, which is that it's intermittent, right? Because like you get solar power when the sun's shining.
Yeah, which depending on where you are, might be 5, 10, maybe 50% of the time if you're lucky.
Yeah. And it's also, when is that solar power available, right? Because solar power is peaked at lunchtime, right?
Oh yeah, so even if you're facing the sun, you might only get like half of the power that you could possibly get from it.
At least on the surface of the Earth. And so if you could get it continuously in space, that would be huge. And so the idea then was like, if you put this thing in a geostationary orbit and you used microwaves to transmit the power, the benefits of this would be it would transfer through the atmosphere largely unimpeded. One of the sort of, I think, things that prevented this concept from the 70s from becoming a reality was that everything was enormous. So the aperture size in space would be the size of a small city, like your aperture size. And when I say aperture size, I'm talking about like how big is the thing that's transmitting or receiving power.
So you needed to have these like massive, like city scale, 7 by 7 mile structures in space.
Like 500 acres in space, right?
Okay.
And so the question is like, well, that's a cool idea, but how does humanity do this? And I think that has been kind of where that idea has lived for kind of a long time. And so it's this very cool idea. I think the motivation behind it is, pretty well founded, but it never happened. And so the idea behind Aetherflux is we want to take this idea and make it a reality. And the way we want to do it is to find like, what is the direct path towards it, right? Like what's the path that we could do it with today's technology? And so our approach, this is not our grandfather's space solar power approach, let's say.
Wait, so what's the grandfather
approach? It's this approach that I'm talking about, this old 1970s sort of monolithic array.
Okay.
Instead, our approach says, hey, what if you could make everything smaller? Or like, is there an architecture that sort of leverages the way that we build technology today, which could make this much more possible? And so like, what if you could build a constellation just as a starting point?
So this is a constellation of satellites or floating solar panels or satellite solar panels.
Yeah, floating solar farms. Could you generate power like that? And if you did that, what sort of method of power transmission would you use? So our basic architecture is, instead of using a monolithic array, we're going to build a constellation of smaller satellites. Each one generates power and then transmits that power down to the ground. Instead of using sort of a phased array of point antennas that use microwave radiation or radio waves, we want to use collimated light, so beams of infrared lasers instead. And the benefits of this are you make everything smaller. So by using lasers for power transmission, we actually can get a much smaller spot on the ground. So
how does that compare old approach versus current laser approach?
So we're talking like, a spot size on the ground that's maybe 100 acres or 500 acres.
That's what was needed previously?
Versus we think, for first mission, we're targeting say 10 to 20 meters diameter on the ground. We think we can actually get that smaller, like sub 10 meters.
It could be like just like a building or less than that even.
So imagine a power receiver that's like not huge. Eventually we want to make these things portable, and sort of like the sort of Starlink ethos, right? Of you can get power wherever you want in the world. And the benefits of this would be you lay out a ground station, and it forms a link with one of the satellites that's passing overhead. And as it's in the field of view, it points down at the ground station. And once it forms a lock with that ground station, we'll transmit power. So we're going off on a couple of tangents here, but the basic idea is to take this concept of space solar power and say, what's the way of doing it that we think is the most straightforward path towards demonstrating it, like with today's technology? And how do we find an architecture there that we think we can scale out to providing useful power for applications?
So it's kind of like figuring out how to like commercialize this versus just, science project or science fiction. Mm-hmm. Like you make money basically.
So this is like another way of saying it, right? Is we want to take this concept from science fiction and make it reality. We also want to commercialize space solar power. And this is like one of the theses behind me wanting to do space. Other than the fact that I just think space is really cool.
Yeah.
And I've kind of wanted to do it my whole life. Is this thesis, and I know we're going to talk about Robinhood in the future, but like it's this thesis that like if you can create more economic opportunities for people, or if you're creating products or services that create different ways for people to pursue their own self-betterment to make money, that one, that's really special. Two, those are the circumstances where like the rate of progress I think the best way I can describe it is like, it's kind of hard to see how quickly things progress, right? So, I mean, when I look at the space industry, right, like there's stuff that humanity does in space right now. We do telecommunications, we do Earth imaging. There's lots of defense applications in space. But I think there's room for more, right? I think there's room for distinct applications in space. And I think one of the first ones is energy, and hence building an energy company.
So I think one of my biggest questions when kind of was looking into everything that you're doing, you're beaming extremely concentrated shot of energy down at the Earth. Kind of sounds unsafe. Is it safe? Like, how does that all work?
So safety is a big part of what we do. One of our first hires of this company was our safety officer. The basic concept behind this, right, is that you have a satellite in space. The way we're contemplating this is going to work is as the satellite's passing overhead, it will look for the ground station. And before it starts sending power, it'll establish a link between the ground station and the satellite. So imagine like a heart beating between the two of them. And the idea is that connection is one of sort of several layers of safety interconnectivity we have between the ground station and the satellite. As we build this, that sort of safety system is going to take into account safety for birds, safety for spacecraft, safety for aircraft in the vicinity, for humanity, for planes, wildlife, the whole spectrum. And there's established standards to work within to do that. But the idea is to actually build a system that's able to safely form a connection between the satellite and the ground station, monitor that connection as it's connected, and then when it sees a clear path, to transmit power. And one of the benefits of the way that we're doing it is that it's a tight beam of light, right? Meaning the goal of this is that we're able to impact that power beam onto a fairly sort of small area. And in turn, we won't have like stray light going to places. You know what I mean?
So for people listening and not watching and didn't see what like motion you just made, like,
Yeah.
How big of a beam? Are we talking like a mile wide? Is this like a couple inches? Like,
Yeah. So this is the thing, right? Is like we want to target a spot size on the ground. At first, it's going to be like low double-digit meters in diameter, but we think it's going to be able to get down to like the 5 to 10 meters in diameter on the ground. I mean, that's not that big, right? Like, and when you think about it, well, on the ground, like it's like the size of a roof.
Yeah.
But if you think about it from the context of space, you're talking about trying to, point at this thing from 550 kilometers.
sounds extremely
really
difficult.
far.
Like
Really
it's like
far.
playing the hardest video game on the hardest difficulty.
Yeah. But like this, we do crazy things with technology, right? Like the technology to do stuff like this, we think is out there, and like we're sort of building right now.
So how long is it going to take you to kind of do all of this? Do you have like thinking around like, all right, 2026 we'll be here, 2030 we might be here. Like, how are you thinking about all that?
Yeah. I mean, okay. So this kind of comes back to what we were saying in the beginning, right? Which is like, what's the motivation behind doing this? And it's to find a direct path towards demonstrating this. Like space solar power is not a thing. Like we don't power stuff on Earth with space solar power. And like the first thing that has to happen is we have to break ground there, and we have to demonstrate a first, like, this is what power from space looks like. It's not going to be a ton of power at first, but like that's like kind of the, you kind of have to think about like what's the proof of concept of the technology, and then there's a distinct thought of like how do you scale this to meet the applications of like providing power to a remote location, all the way up to like the broad ambition of like how do you power humanity,
Like a home or like a downtown or something.
I mean like cities,
Yeah.
right? Like states, nations, the whole world. Like
Yeah.
that's like the big broad ambition. So we're not going to do that at first, right? So the question is like, how do you distill that down to a first, like...
Yeah, do you have an idea of like the first thing we're going to
totally.
try to do?
Yeah. So this is what we're working on right now. And that path is basically like, what is the path to do this with stuff that's either commercially available right now, either off the shelf. Let's do some custom stuff, but like, let's really keep that to the stuff where we have to do it. How do we demonstrate this capability using technology that exists today? So for example, for power transmission, we're using infrared lasers, right? If you think about, well, I'll tell you what the broad architecture stack is for the first mission that goes up beginning of 2026. So
Okay. So we're like a year away.
Yeah, we've got a lot of work to do for the next year. But you can kind of think of it as like, well, what are the big components of this mission, right? Well, first part is the SpaceX rideshare. Like that's commercially available, right? Like we bought that. Which, what an amazing company.
So this is you get a ride on a SpaceX rocket, it shoots you up, and you got your first satellite in orbit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I call it the laser barnacle.
Laser barnacle, because you catch a ride, yeah, like a barnacle.
Yeah, you're like
Okay.
you're sort of like hanging on the top of the, you're inside of the fairing, but you're just like you're bolted onto the.
I could just see like the little thing like bolted on the side of the SpaceX rocket as it's taken off.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it actually going to look like that?
it's going to be a I think it's going to be about the size of this table, bolted to the side of the. Not to the outside of the rocket, just to be clear.
Oh, okay. I was like, that sounds crazy, but okay.
No, there's a big fairing on top of it, but there
Okay,
is still
okay.
a mounting structure inside.
Okay.
Hence the barnacle.
So will you ride on like a ride, like it's like a ride share almost in space, but are there going to be multiple other payloads potentially on that ship? Okay.
They call it a rideshare.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
How many different things might go up in one SpaceX launch? Like, can you like 1 or 2, 3 people? Is it like potentially like 100 different satellites on that
I don't
trip?
remember what the number is. It's not 2 or 3, and I don't think it's 100. I think it's somewhere in between.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one of the things you're thinking is like, we're creating like a railroad to get into space, like a transportation channel to get commerce.
SpaceX is doing that for us.
Yeah. Okay.
But
And-
like that's from the point of view of commercially available, right? Like rides to space are available commercially, right? You don't have to build a rocket to do that.
So
Like,
before SpaceX, like
Mhm.
if you wanted to get something into space, did you work with NASA or, I mean, I think there's some satellite internet companies, like maybe 1 or 2 publicly traded ones where like, they'd put a satellite in space and then you could get satellite internet on your aircraft, like on your Delta flight or whatever. So there's like a little bit of stuff happening, but I know it was like we'd launch 1 a year or we'd be planning our launch like 3 years out. So it's probably a pretty big deal to the extent now like SpaceX does multiple a week, right? I
Yeah.
think, and they're run rating soon at like every day.
I mean, they also have multiple ride shares a year, right?
That's awesome.
So, I mean, I could wax poetic about how impressive SpaceX is ad nauseum. But so back to the point of like, what's the first mission?
Yep.
This is kind of like trying to paint the picture of like the earnest sort of pursuit was like, how do you do this, right? Like there's so many ways to do this where you're not going to have this happen for like a decade, right? You can certainly create a sort of system design here where you have to go and like invent something new before you do it. This is not the goal. So one part, ride to space. You can buy it.
You got your satellite up there, it's floating. What happens then?
Second part is a satellite.
Okay.
You can buy that. So we bought a satellite bus from a company called Apex, in which I'm a small investor. And so we're building on top of that. Again, that's commercially available, right? Like we were able to accelerate so dramatically because of that, and great company that's fun to work with them. And then the actual power transmission laser system, like these high power lasers at the frequencies that we're operating, these are out there, right?
Really?
There's actually one in that lab over there,
Really?
like a
Okay.
test unit. Yep.
So you can just get them off of like Alibaba, AliExpress. Where do you get them from?
It's way more complicated than that.
Okay.
There's manufacturers that make them, and then you can buy one, but you're not going to fly that thing, right? There's a whole different process for like getting it ready to work in the space environment. But again, like these things exist. Like we bought one, it's in there, right?
So you hook it to the satellite.
We have to engineer the whole thing together. And the last is the ground station. And the ground stations are, the simplest version is solar panels, batteries, and some other optics, like some reflecting optics. And like, these are the pieces you need to do this. Like, we're not talking about like, you know, like we're not talking about creating some like exotic state of matter here to do this, right? We're not talking about like manufacturing carbon nanotubes like the size of a space elevator. Like, we're talking about buying pieces and engineering them together. And the reason I think this is really important is like, I think that's the engineering approach to this, which is like, how can you do this in a way that doesn't require like a string of breakthroughs versus how do you improve on stuff that exists today? That leads to the second thing, which is like, how do you do a sequence of launches like this where for the first mission, the goal is to demonstrate power transmission, right?
So it's just to like, does it work? Can you
demonstrate
make it happen? Yeah.
And to actually rectify the power on the ground to show that that power is useful for something, but keep the requirements simple, right? And like, from that ladder up to higher power, more constellation stuff, like there's going to be a myriad of other things that we want to test that sort of follow in that. But again, like as an entrepreneur, my mindset was, what's the most direct path towards doing this? And like, how do we do that directly as opposed to, you know, like go through the cycles of iteration without actually building the real thing? Because I think you learn so much more when you do the real thing.
And what is going to be the first test? Like are you doing it? Are you like working with a hospital, a family, the military? Like, is this going to be in middle of the US, middle of Antarctica? Like, what are you thinking about site and partner?
Yeah, I think demonstration will probably be done pretty closely with DoD partners. Probably will be hosted in a no-fly zone. So think places like White Sands, New Mexico.
Is this because it's just less risk of, like, no-fly zone is just, there's less complications in the air?
Yeah, I mean, also we're planning on, you know, serving military applications with this as well. So think like getting power out to the forward deployed bases. Like when we think about how do we achieve this like really broad goal of providing power for all kinds of like real world applications, the first part is like, how do we match the thing that we're building to the market that needs it the most, right?
And isn't the US military like the #1 consumer of fuel in the world or some insane stat like that?
I don't know if it's the #1 consumer of fuel, but I think the US military is the biggest consumer of energy in the government, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. I mean, that would possibly be the world too, I guess. But.
Yeah. I mean, I know they use, I think they, well, we can just double check this number.
Are we fact checking?
Yeah. Hey, Jack, how much does the DoD spend on fuel a year? I want to say it's $14.5 billion. But I want to make sure
$14.5 billion on fuel a year.
I want to make sure it's $14.5 billion, not 14.5 billion gallons. Because I remember
which would be more. It'd be a big number.
I just don't know which the unit is.
I think I actually.
There you go. 14 billion on energy per year.
So one customer, take 100% market share with the customer. That's 14 billion in revenue.
I mean, that's a huge market, right?
Yeah, it's massive, that alone.
We could take a small percentage of that market share and build a very meaningful business, right? So that's the place to start. And like, how much energy does the world use in a year?
I mean, it's like 10% of GDP or something.
Yeah,
I don't know what it is, but it's massive.
And the way that we kind of think about it is like those DoD applications are forward deployed bases, right?
Yep.
Like those are the places where it's hardest to get fuel. It's the most dangerous. Those are the contested environments.
True, yeah.
Where what we're building, we think has some pretty inherent advantages. I'd say one of those is that, these ground stations, if you kind of think about the size that we want to get to, like these are intended to be portable, meaning you could have a sort of like more powerful one that's like a semi-permanent installation. I can also imagine a world in the future where if we're able to get the optics to be even more performant, that we're able to make the ground stations like entirely portable, where you might be able to take a ground station, package it up, and have troops carry it into a contested environment, lay it out, generate power, and then package it back up. Like that, those are some of the benefits we get from the high level architectural designs. Because again, we're transmitting power, a beam of power with lasers, right? That inherently means that the spot on the ground is going to be tightly concentrated.
And I guess to just kind of like to wrap it all up and succinctly describe it, it's, you're sort of the thing that's on the ground is basically a solar panel, and you're just beaming an extremely concentrated, powerful ray of light that just, it's like the most optimal way of delivering solar energy.
Mm-hmm. And the cool thing is that as the sort of thing you care about here is like, what is the power density on the ground? And like, you want to have high power density if you want energy to be useful, right? So that's actually like one of the key parts of this architecture is like, if you push a bunch of energy down to the ground, but your receiver is like absolutely enormous, it's going to be very diffuse. And like, you're going to have a ton of infrastructure to be able to rectify that power. Like you want to have that infrastructure on the ground be compact.
And then and then thinking beyond military purposes, defense purposes, everybody uses electricity, every single person in building. And so that's probably like I mean, probably not next year, but a couple of years in the future.
That's what we want to build to. Yeah. And I think also in the process of, again, the goal is to get iteration cycles. And that's the reason why we're trying to do a first version of this pretty quickly. I think also the thing is it's the process of, it's the process of developing this technology that you kind of figure out like exactly how to build it, right? Just like a simple analogy, like I don't know if you've seen that little picture on the internet of like the versions of the Raptor engine, right? Where the first version is like
smaller and smaller. Yeah,
the first version looks like a spider web. The second version looks like a slightly cleaned up spider web, and the third version just looks like, holy cow! Like how this just looks like the final version of this. Like it seems like the ideal version of doing this.
Yep.
A little bit of that, right? Is like right now we're building the spider web. And it's inherently through building the complicated version, the one where you don't know all the answers, where you learn a bunch of stuff by doing it and doing it again and doing it again, that you get the clarity to like what that sort of final state is going to be.
Well, speaking about learning things, doing things over and over again, how did you first kind of get into physics and like building stuff like this? Like, what's the story there?
Yeah. I mean, I've loved physics my whole life. Like I kind of grew up with it as like one of the big backdrops. Like my dad was a physicist, right? Like that was the reason my family came to the US. And my dad had wanted to study physics his whole life. It was kind of a cool story. So he was like the one kid, and this is the story he tells me, he was like the one kid in the town that he grew up in that was always trying to come to America to study physics. He was
that not a thing? He's
from like Bhavnagar and Gujarat in India in like the 70s and 80s. Like
okay.
This is, yeah.
What did kids aspire to be?
I mean, my grandfather in India was one of the first Western trained eye doctors. And so
Western trained?
Yeah.
Eye doc? Oh, Western trained.
Yeah. Like he was an optometrist.
Okay.
And so like, that was kind of the thing is like all of my grandfather's children were going to go into optometry. My dad was like, I want to study physics. As one does, and did still go into optometry. He was a contact lens person in India for a long time. I guess that's optics, isn't it? And this is all a little eerie. I realized my dad was doing optics, and now I'm doing optics too. Weird.
It runs in the family. You can't get away. Family, yeah. It was destined.
Yeah. So that's what he did in India and was applying to PhD programs to study physics in America. And was famously like, I'm not going to get married because I want to devote my life to science. That did not work out well for him. He also said he wasn't going to have kids. Did not work out well for him.
I mean, nothing ever goes as you think.
Yeah.
It never goes to plan.
And so, he ends up getting married to my mom. My mom was pregnant with me. My mom did not want to come to America.
Really?
Had no interest in coming to America because, they both come from big families in India. And my mom was the youngest. My dad was also the youngest. But my mom was going to stay and like sort of stay with her family in India. Lo and behold, my dad's like got in, and my mom was originally going to stay back in India. The story goes, they go to the embassy. They see that my mom is pregnant. They're like, cool, your son's coming to America.
Wow.
And that's kind of how this is going on. You said you wanted to talk for a while, so I'm giving you the long version.
This is the long version, yeah. And so, well, I guess the TLDR then is you landed in the U.S. and your dad was a physicist at university, I think you said?
University of Huntsville, Alabama.
Which is that then one of the NASA sites, like one of the kind of HQs?
Yeah, I think so. There was a bunch of changes that happened in like the 80s or 90s around that. There was like some NASA program, I think, around that time. And I think the Reagan administration changed something. But no, there's a lot of aerospace activity in Huntsville. And then my dad ends up and gets a job at NASA at Langley Air Force Base. And so that's where I grew up with my dad, like working at NASA. And he was like, I always remember going to see his like, there were those giant wind tunnels at Langley Air Force Base.
Yep.
Which I've
the testing where they would like test aerodynamics and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's seeing that stuff as a kid, right? It's like these magical, facilities to test this crazy aerospace stuff.
Yeah.
And it really, really left an impression on me. And I studied physics at Stanford. Like I went on to basically pursue this. Lo and behold, had a little bit of a detour in my professional career. I went into finance, which we can talk about what that journey was like. But I'd grown up around this my whole life, and I had this sort of desire to want to leave a mark in, this deep science, space, physics industry. And I think growing up in that generation, right? Like you kind of look at what the aerospace industry was when we were kids, and you hear about like the moon landing and you hear about all this stuff.
That was like legendary American lore, right?
Yeah.
Like the moon landing is like one of the most significant moments in human history, probably.
Yeah. But like that shit happened before I was born.
Yeah.
And it was always this weird thing where it's like, did space exploration already happen? Because it didn't feel like we kind of did enough. Anyways, I had this sort of passion for space, and I told myself that I was just very curious about commercial space flight, and that if that was emerging and kind of becoming a thing, I was like, at some point I want to be a part of this.
Well, so I think that then it's an interesting transition of, we'll talk about the software finance detour, but there was a point where you're like, okay, I want to start applying some of this physics that I know. I want to go from 0 to 1 on just building physical things. I know there's a lot of founders listening that they're going through similar, process right now. How did you do it?
I built a car.
Was this during COVID?
This is during COVID, yeah.
Okay. How'd it go?
It works. It's good. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a company called Factory 5 Racing. You ever heard of that?
Never heard of it.
They're based out of Massachusetts. They make kit cars of like old Shelby race cars.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so you get a kit and
Yeah.
you like assemble the car.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not like a Lego assembly. There's like all the pieces don't fit together nicely.
Is it like welding? Is it like, fastening harness stuff?
There's a
like
lot of fastening stuff. There's a lot of metal shaving. There's a lot of like getting electrical stuff to work. I didn't have to do any welding on that one, but like there's a lot of fluid dynamics. There's a lot of like machinery. And it's also just like, I always thought like the littlest stuff with that was really cool, which is like when you're like putting a piece together, right? And you've got like a torque spec where it's like tighten this thing up to this torque requirement. And like use this kind of bolt or use this kind of like thread locker. I was just like, why? Like, what is the material science here? Like, why? How did they come up with this metal and this torque number? Like, I always remember being very curious about that kind of stuff, which was probably the beginning of me like kind of asking the question of like, okay, I can do it. Like, I can physically assemble a thing, but like, what? Why these choices? Why does it work like this?
So do you recommend to somebody that wants to get into this, buy a car kit and build a car?
I think that if you want to build space hardware, I think that might be the single best way to do it.
Really? Okay.
I'm joking around. I say that because I think that's what got me into it.
Yeah. I'm sure there's someone else listening. There's probably people listening to this that are thinking on both sides, like most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Probably some people like, oh, that's also what I did.
Yeah, it really captured my imagination. Like I really, really enjoyed the creative process.
Do you get any creativity in that, or is it kind of like a Lego instruction? Like, here's what you need to do.
Oh, there's the assembling the thing, which is like you need Like you don't want to be creative and like not torque something up. Like that's
mangled apart.
Yeah, no, I think the creativity comes in like what engine do you put in it? Like what are the components? Like how does it work the way that it does? Like are you using, using power steering, or are you going for a manual steering rack, right? Like all the way to like what is the sort of design of the finished product look like.
And are you a big car fan? Like do you have a lot of cars? Do you like cars?
I love cars.
Yeah,
I love cars.
What is your favorite car? Whether you have it or not.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I had to pick one favorite car. Probably go with like a 1973 Porsche 911 RS.
So a classic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I like my cars old and stinky.
Old and stinky. Yeah, I won't make any jokes from that.
Are you saying I'm old and stinky?
No, I was like, like someone's like, oh, I like my something like this. And say, oh, just like I like my blank.
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't think of anything. So
I thought you were saying I was old and stinky. And I was like, my goodness, that's rather forward of you.
No, I was going to say, actually, it feels like you always have had like very regal haircuts. As one of my friends, Jaron Glover.
Yeah.
He's like, you gotta get him to talk about how like his hair is always like so good. Has that been a thing?
Talking about how good my hair is,
or having
really good hair,
like caring about your hairstyle. Like it feels like your hair has always been very put together.
Jack, what how do you feel about my hair?
The hair has gone through many different evolutions.
Many different evolutions, Jack said.
It's like back sometimes, and it's now.
I think
very small.
It's been extremely small in the past.
Extremely small?
Yeah, very small.
Okay. Well, I'm also going through my first real like hairstyle evolution.
You got some good hair
at the
going
moment.
on. Yeah,
I let it. It's sort like if I let it grow another 3 months, it'll start looking like a mullet. Like I think I'm in like the early stage. I got it trimmed up a little bit. It's not I don't think it's a mullet yet.
Would you like me to trim your hair?
Right here.
I can do that right now.
I mean, I know you got to go in like half an hour, so that might cut the end of the podcast. Maybe we could, the rest of this thing is just you cutting my hair and you're talking.
Dude, this guy is cracking up.
The camera guy, Ty, is like, I don't want to deal with this right now. Adjust the mics.
Okay, so seriously, like a serious like thing that has been a huge revelation for me. You ever watch that Seinfeld episode where it's like I've watched a lot of Seinfeld. It's one of the later seasons. It's like George and Jerry. It's like the beginning of the episode. It starts with like both of them at like a coffee table and they both got mustaches.
Okay.
And they talk about how instead of going on a vacation, they grew mustaches to take a vacation from themselves. This is totally real.
I've never heard of this before, but
you should.
Well, I'll find the clip. I'll try to throw it in the show notes if people want to check it out.
You should grow a mustache. I say this because there is a mustached version of every single one of us that's hiding in there.
Really? Like big, bushy, like 70s, 80s style
Yeah, it's
mustache.
just like there's a slightly different version of you in there.
Huh.
And like you should meet that person at some point.
Maybe when
this guy's still cracking up.
As my mullet grows out a little bit more, maybe I'll throw in a mustache.
Yeah. That's a good look. I like it.
Well, so one thing, so I do want to talk about Robinhood, but I think an interesting transition is when you were telling me the meaning of the word Aetherflux.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean, and how does that connect to Robinhood?
Yeah, so the name Aetherflux comes from a love of old science, and so this particular one, I think Vlad and I kind of like stumbled upon our love of this around the same time. So back in college, we were doing this one program. We were doing this project for a guy that was trying to come up with a slightly different theory of gravity at the time. Like he didn't believe in Einstein's theory. He was looking for physics undergrads to help him like poke holes in Einstein's theory. And Vlad and I were like, cool, we'll do that.
And that's you ended up being your co-founder at Robinhood.
Yeah.
For people who don't know. Okay.
And so we were doing this like summer research thing with this guy who had like an alternative theory of gravity. And he was like, you got to go to the primary texts and like understand the history of how Einstein arrived at the special theory of relativity.
So is this like Greek texts, like back like thousands of years ago, or?
No, it's like 150 years ago.
Oh, okay. Like
so
did Einstein wrote, or?
Yeah, Einstein's seminal like special theory of relativity, I believe, is 1904 or 1905.
Okay.
And so, okay, what is this theory of special relativity, right? So back in the 1800s, there was this thing called the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was actually done at Case Western University. It was the 1850s, which was basically to try to figure out the speed of light. And the idea was that light is a wave, right? Like sound, like water. And so as it's a wave, it travels through a medium, right? So sound waves travel through air, like waves on water travel on the surface of the water. So what is the medium that light travels through? And so there's a bunch of experiments done trying to figure out what this medium was. They didn't quite know what it was, so they called it the aether. And without going into too many details about said Michelson-Morley experiment, although it is very cool, it was very confusing because like people were measuring the speed of light, and this Michelson-Morley experiment, it's like, well, if you have like a split mirror and you have light going in this direction and light going in this direction, like this platform, whatever it is that we're talking about here, is still on the surface of the Earth. The Earth is rotating around the sun, right? It's rotating around its own axis. And so wouldn't you expect to see light moving in a slightly different speed in this direction versus that direction? Right? Sounds reasonable? Yeah, that's not right. That's like all completely wrong, actually.
Okay. Wait, so light just moves through air?
So
like, is it just...
So Einstein came along and was like, all y'all are completely wrong.
Okay.
Like, this is just completely wrong.
So you were trying to prove Einstein wrong, basically, like...
We were trying to prove that when Einstein proved everyone wrong, that he was wrong.
Okay.
And we were wrong in our proving that he was wrong.
Okay.
And in turn, I think he was right.
Okay. Fair. Is that how you met Vlad then? Was working?
Oh, I'd known Vlad from before that. We had been friends for a while.
Was it like high school summer camp, physics camp, I think, or something?
No, we met in the Stanford physics program, I think 2 summers before.
Okay.
But back to this aether theory. So there was this idea that light travels through a medium called aether. It turns out that light actually doesn't have a medium that it travels through because light is very special. And that light doesn't actually have different speeds in different conditions. It's actually the reference frame that changed to accommodate light being the same speed in all reference frames. This is what Einstein's theory of special relativity is.
Okay.
Anyways, there was this fictitious medium called the aether, which I always thought was very cool. And the idea of Aetherflux is kind of like harvesting the flux through this fictitious medium.
Interesting. And it's kind of what you're doing. You're sending light through mediums.
Yeah.
Different mediums.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you did this thing with Vlad. It was like, how did you guys go from trying to prove Einstein wrong, ended up being wrong, to Robinhood? I mean, I know there's a little bit of a journey, but what was that like?
Well, we were both physics and math kids at Stanford. We were very earnestly focused on doing that as undergrads and as graduate students. Like, I didn't have much interest in business. I didn't in retrospect, I think it kind of makes sense that I started a company, but at the time that was I wanted to study physics. I wanted to be an academic, and maybe 10% of me wanted to be a musician.
What's your favorite artist of all time?
Oh, I don't know if I have a favorite artist of all time, but I will say I got a lot of love for Tupac.
Wow. Okay.
Got a lot of love for Tupac.
I wasn't expecting that. R.I.P.
Rest in peace.
So then how did you end up starting a company? Why did you decide to do that instead of music
academia?
Or physics? Yeah, or academia.
So I left. So after I graduated, worked for a little while, decided pretty quickly I wanted to start a company. Called up Vlad. It's like, hey, we should do this together because we'd already been really good friends.
Yep.
Convinced him to not pursue his academic background or academic career in math. And so the first summer, moved out to New York and decided to start a trading company, to get into quantitative trading, algorithmic trading. That did not go very well. Then we decided. What
did not go well? Could you not figure it out? Did you lose money? Was it boring?
We just couldn't really figure it out. We weren't we weren't set up to succeed, I feel like. But also we were trying to compete in a very, very difficult environment.
Did you learn anything from it? And maybe that was it?
Well, from that, we kind of like, we were kind of interested in these, like what was happening in financial services. At the time, I remember thinking that there were some tectonic plates that were moving and that markets were becoming more and more electronic. This is like 10 years ago, more. And so we were like interested in like, what's the trend that's going to emerge from markets becoming much more electronic? And at some point we kind of had this light bulb that went off where it's like, actually the way that this could become very real for ordinary people is like, if markets go electronic, the costs associated with it change. Could you then use that sort of like hypothesis to build a consumer product around that gets to zero commission stock trading as we did? The interesting thing was like Vlad and I are like, we were like math and physics kids, and like in our spare time, even back then, we would stay up into the wee hours of the night and like, oh, check out this like high school kid that built a fusion reactor in his like, his backyard. And we were like, well, what if you could mine helium-3 on the moon? Like these were like the machinations we had in the wee hours of the night. And again, kind of coming back to what I was saying a little while ago, which is like, it felt like space happened before I was born. And I told myself, like, if I ever saw a path towards it happening again in my lifetime, it was something I was really, really interested in. Like, and so it was kind of this, seeing the first Falcon or the first SpaceX landing of the rocket, I was like, oh my God, like, might this actually happen in my lifetime?
So it's probably like, you knew you always kind of wanted to come back to this, but just the timing just didn't quite make sense yet. And then it did a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had this dream in my mind that if like, it's like if ever this finance thing ever goes really well, maybe I'll do that. But like, how do you plan for that, right?
Yeah. Well, so then how did you end up doing Robinhood? Like, how did you come into that specific idea? Because I know you guys tried a bunch of different things. There was a social trading thing. I remember kind of, I never saw it or used it, but I remember that was kind of a piece of it. Yeah.
We were working on what is Robinhood today when we were doing that too.
Okay.
Yeah. We had this hypothesis pretty early on that if you could make investing in the stock market zero commission, and you could make it like mobile at the time, think about building financial products on mobile. Like, this was not a thing.
Yeah, I think I was using Scottrade when Robinhood launched, or I think it's like TD Ameritrade. I think it's been acquired multiple times, but I signed up for it because it was the cheapest brokerage. And I remember having to go into a branch and make an account. And I remember, I think it was either $9 or $6 a trade. And I think I signed up because I got like 3 free trades. So I was like, I'll buy a couple stocks and I just won't sell them and I'll never have to pay the commission, or it was something like that. And I remember also in my head, I always made sure I bought in blocks of at least 1,000, because then the fee drag was lower. Because like if you buy and then you sell, you're paying about $10 per trade or whatever. On $1,000, it's like 2% fee drag on one position, like going in and out. And I remember, I remember when Robinhood launched, I think I saw it on like a forum that I don't know if you ever remembered, the end of the internet.
Mm-mm.
It was just like secret underground, private, invite only forum thing. And some guy was like obsessed with it. He was, how like all these movements, you need like someone who's just like ridiculously obsessed. This guy was like constantly posting all the updates. I think he was taking stuff from Reddit, hyping his link, moving up, putting a screenshot of how you like moved up the wait list. And I remember me and my friends were on there, were like, damn, this looks pretty cool. Like, this is actually kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's what I was working on back then.
Yeah. So what was going on at that point on your end? Like, you guys it took a while to launch.
Mm-hmm.
You're raising money took a while. I think the launch was kind of accidental too, sort of. I guess order of operations, like what happened next? You had this idea, you started building it.
Yeah, we had this idea. We thought that, like, I think looking back on it now, right? Like, we thought that if we could make this exactly what you're talking about here, right? We're like, a lot of people aren't using the stock market because of this.
Yep.
And like, we think that there's a huge underserved market here of our generation of people. Moreover, like, this kind of comes back to who I think both of us are as people and kind of our life experiences, right? For both of us, we're both only children. Families both moved to the US because our dads were pursuing academic careers here. Both grew up in Virginia, right? We both were studying physics and math at Stanford. I think a part of this also was like, it was pretty deeply ingrained in my brain that this was the land of opportunity, you know? And like being in America was, it was a huge sacrifice that my parents made. Right. And I have cousins and stuff. I had family in India, and like, it was, you know, this was the place where if you could make a life here, it was the envy of the whole world. Right. And here we were as like young men coming of age, right? Like very much a coming of age story where there's like this real like intellectual disconnect that was happening, because on the one hand, we're like this is the land of opportunity, and like this is the place where like people can have access to capitalism in the financial system. Like this isn't a bad thing. Where at the same time, a lot of people of our generation, and this is like, you know, Occupy Wall Street movement stuff, where like the system's broken, tear it down. And we're like, this just does not reconcile with our worldview, right? Like why would you want to tear this down? There's another path here, which is that you actually make it so that everybody can be a part of it, right? And like if you did that, you would solve the real thing here, which is that people feel disconnected from this system. And there's a people that have, you know, that are having great, you know, better outcomes or whatever from it, and like other people are just not a part of it. You could tear the whole thing down, or you could get more people to be a part of it. And we believe that that was the, like that was the world we wanted to live in. Like,
yeah,
I think at that point, right, when you're starting a company, you don't actually think you're going to solve a problem like that. Like that's
like the scope and the scale that it all gets to, you never know.
I mean, you'd have to be crazy to think that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you also have to remember the backdrop at this point, where we had been entrepreneurs for the better part of 5 years and didn't have a whole lot to show for it. Right? And so you kind of ask the question, it's like, well, what makes you think that this is going to have this wild outcome? You don't, right? You like kind of think one step ahead, and you're like, what is our hypothesis here? Like, why do we, you know?
Yeah. Now, I was talking to Chad Byers at SUSE, and he said, I think one of the numbers is 70. One of the numbers is 110 investors that you talked to for the seed round. No one was giving you money. What was that like? How did that go?
Both numbers sound very painful.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
What was the challenge? I mean, talking about it today, it sounds like obvious, right? Like it sounds like a great intersection and great pitch. Market financial services is like 20% of GDP or something. Like,
I think it's interesting from a platform perspective. That's kind of how I think about it. So
you mean Robinhood as a product is interesting as a platform?
Well, I think more like mobile as a platform, or like underlying platform technologies, right? When we were starting Robinhood, like one of the theses was that mobile is going to be people's computer, right? Like that's going to be the device that is effectively their computer.
Was this like 2012, 13-ish?
13, 14.
Okay. So it was like kind of prominent, but maybe not as obvious.
There were some people, there were like financial apps on phones. Our thesis was that this is actually kind of the default place to do this, and it should be the de facto place that you are able to do this, because you're carrying it around with you all the time, right? At the time, that was like one of the things that was kind of viewed as crazy. It's like, well, what makes you think that people are going to want to have their finances on their phone? Like, you know, that's like what if they like lose their phone, or, you know, these sort of like questions about how people are going to use technology, where in retrospect, it's obvious that you would use your phone for money because it's a computer and it's actually convenient having it in your pocket.
It's like a wallet, right? Like having money in your wallet or in your pocket.
My phone has my wallet on the back of it. They are the same object in 2025 for me. You know, it was like, y'all don't know how to build consumer products. You know, you guys haven't done this before. You're math people, right? And what makes you think that there's a generation of young people that is underserved? Like they could use these other things. Like what makes you think that this is the thing that's missing?
Yeah.
And yeah, it was, there was a lot of naysayers.
How did that make you feel as someone? I know you're really big on design and creativity. Like how did it make you feel?
Motivated.
Motivated, very motivated.
How
How do you channel that as someone who you're going through a lot of no's, like how do you channel the motivation in the right way?
I love it. I mean, I'm serious. Like I really, really feed off of that. And I think that it's like a challenge, right? It's like, I like love basketball, right? Like I've grew up like with the idols in that world of like the Michael Jordans and the Kobe Bryants, right? And there's a level of focus, determination, and using setbacks to bring out the best in yourself. I mean, that's just kind of how my brain works. Like I love it.
So you guys were kind of determined you were going to make it work, and their setbacks made it harder, but you just knew you'd figure it out eventually.
I mean, these are the kind of incongruent truths you have to keep it in your head simultaneously. You have to both be incredibly inquisitive, and you have to ask the questions of like, what don't I know? Like what rock do I have to look under that I haven't looked under yet? Or like, where is the insight? And you have to be like very open to being wrong, right? You have to be open to putting your ideas out there and just being wrong. Right. That's the one part of it. The other part is you also have to be determined, right? You have to believe in your ideas, and you have to like have your own belief in yourself. Like, and that's kind of like one of the things that's always been very resonant for me is like knowing where the outside opinions stop and where my own viewpoint starts. Cause yeah, a lot of no's, it was like very difficult back then. And like over time, I've kind of learned to channel that, right? And use that use that as like positive motivation.
Yeah. And I think you guys sort of had to do it. I don't know if this is like terms as part of the deal, but you had like an interesting agreement to finally get someone to invest. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Tim Draper?
Yeah. What happened there?
Oh man. Yeah. So this was, this was like when we were at the pits of not being able to raise any money. And we went and met with Tim Draper, and we kind of told him what our idea was. And this man is larger than life.
He's probably one of the most interesting people.
This man is larger than life.
Yes.
And I remember going to his spot in San Mateo. And I think we were like, there's like a Tesla that had been cut in half, like in the middle of the place, and we're sitting there. He's wearing like a Spider-Man tie, and we're like, holy cow, we're like meeting with Tim Draper.
Yep.
And he's like, well, it's a great idea. It's never going to work. You're never going to get past like, these approvals that you have or whatever.
You need a broker or dealer license or something?
Mm-hmm. And we were working on that at the time. And he's like, how much are you paying yourselves? And we're like, what? It's like, how much are you paying yourselves? And we're like, I don't know, like not very much, like enough to like 60, 70, 80,000, like, I don't know, like not like enough to be able to live in the Bay Area and have an apartment. He's like, that's way too much. Great idea. Never going to happen. You guys are paying yourselves too much. And we leave this meeting and we're just confused.
Why is that a sticking point?
We're just
$60K a year. That's
we're just like we're confused, right? It's like we're paying 70,000, 80,000, maybe the most. Like, I don't know.
Did you have student loans still at the time?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that was like probably 8, 10, 12% of your salary.
I mean, yeah, I had like a dinky little apartment I was living in, right?
San Francisco is an expensive city.
Palo Alto. And so we after this meeting, we're both like feeling, I was feeling pretty dejected. And so we got, and I think we went to get burgers across the street. And we have the idea that we'll tell him that we're gonna not pay ourselves, until we get this approval.
Yeah.
And we'll do that if he invests. And he said yes. And then like the sort of like the gut check came in where it's like, okay, can I still afford gas?
Yeah.
Or am I going to have to start biking to work? Right. Like we did it.
You started biking to work?
Well, I was biking to work as such, but I was like, I'm definitely going to bike to work now.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, there was a couple of months where I was like, okay, it's just like, we got to do this. Right. And again, very clarifying, very focusing. Like this is kind of the thing, right? Is you have to take the setbacks and use it to bring out the best in yourself.
My friend Jaron Glover, also at Robinhood, I think I might have mentioned him earlier. He said to ask how you guys got the domain name. I think it was an interesting story.
Yeah, we had the domain robinhood.io originally. And we had this sort of like kind of very half-baked launch where we were going to try to do like a normal announcement where we were going to go and talk to a bunch of tech reporters. Kind of in the vein of getting turned down by a bunch of VCs. Like we couldn't really get any reporters to want to talk to us.
Really?
Yeah. And so we're like, all right, let's just test how this website works. That's kind of how it got out there. I remember that the first day, 2 days, like right after it had kind of just like been posted on a bunch of forums, I get an inbound from Aaron Levie, the founder of Box. And have you met this guy before?
Yeah, I've actually had him on the podcast before.
This man's brain works a mile a minute. He's like,
he's like the most interesting guy to have on a podcast.
He's super interesting, but it's like his brain works so fast. And I remember like, I was like, one, I was starstruck. And two, I was like, oh my God, why are like, I hadn't done anything of any note in the world, I felt like at that point. And then all of a sudden people were contacting me. And I remember in that first day, he's like, you should get the domain robinhood.com.
That was his thinking during the launch.
And I remember within that first day, like, I remember he emailed me again. He's like, wait, like you need to do this. Like he was like very insistent that like, you need to do this like right now.
Really?
And I was like, all right, this guy is clearly important to do. And I was like, well, let's see if we can get it.
Yeah.
Robinhood.com.
And there's a story there, but yeah, well, I think another question that you just alluded to, this launch that sounds like you were trying to plan something and you're like, oh, it just kind of happened. What happened with the launch?
I remember we were trying to get Google Analytics working. That was like big top of mind, right? So we were like, okay, we need to get some traffic to the page, see if it works. And all of a sudden we're starting to see traffic. And we're like, where's this traffic coming from?
Because you hadn't like launched yet, right?
And we were like testing Google Analytics, if I remember.
Yep.
And somebody like it gets posted on these forums and we start to see traffic from like Reddit and Hacker News. And like, it's like, all right, cool. Like somebody posted it, but then like the traffic is just like, it
keeps going.
It's going. And we're like, oh my God, I think we just announced our product like somewhat inadvertently. This was on like a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Right.
So you weren't ready.
No, I wake up the next morning and I'm like checking my phone and like I was in the habit of reading Hacker News back then. And I'm like reading through Hacker News and I like scroll past like Robinhood, moon landing or some other thing. And I'm like, burp. Wait a sec. What?
Robinhood? What?
Wait a sec. What? And then I remember it's like got on the phone with everyone. I was like, guys, we have to get in. We're launching today. And I think that was the day that I got the sort of like, hey, you need to look at this domain name email from Aaron.
Interesting, huh? And you said like I think you've mentioned that was like your favorite moment in Robinhood. Is that still true?
Really, really eye-opening moment. So I'll tell you, I think as an entrepreneur, this is really interesting because like, what is product market fit? This was a question that I was like very, very interested in understanding.
It's a very abstract.
It's super abstract, right? And if you have product market fit, like it's off to the races and you'll make mistakes, you'll get stuff right, but you'll be on a baseline of doing something that people want.
Yeah.
Right. And like the general sort of contours of the thing that you're doing match what people want. The thing is like, if you don't have product market fit, and you've never seen it before, it's sometimes difficult to know that you don't have it. Because you might have some adoption, right? And it might be just very lossy, right? Or it might be very difficult to convince or to like to get people to try the thing for the first time or like to like read through what the thing is, right? And I had actually never really seen product market fit before. And that day, the day that it sort of just like started taking off on these forums, I was like, I think I learned something that day, which is like, what is product market fit? What is the heuristic? Is it a metric? Is it like when this quantity crosses this other quantity and like there's a full moon and Like, you know, it's actually just when the thing you're doing works better than you expected. Like you have like middling expectations, sort of like good expectations and great expectations, right? Product market fit is like whatever you estimate the thing to be, it's going to do better than that. That's, I think, the simplest heuristic I found for it. So like we said differently, right? I think at the time it was like, what does a group of 1,000 people look like? And I think as humans, we can kind of conceptualize that and kind of like imagine a big concert or something like that, right? What does like 10,000 people look like? Like, yeah, you could kind of imagine like, you know, like a giant,
It's like an arena.
like an arena full of people, right?
Yeah.
What does 100,000 people look like? Like, I don't know. I can't really conceptualize that.
That was like the wait list you guys had like within a week. I don't know the timing, but
Yeah, it was pretty quickly. It was
Yeah.
pretty quickly. I think it might have been a couple of weeks, maybe a month, but it was really quick.
yeah.
But like, what does 100,000 people look like? Or like, what do the opinions of 100,000 people look like? I think it's very difficult for the human brain to conceptualize that. It's just the size of that group of people is like, you know, in nature, humans never encountered 100,000 other people in any one environment.
Yeah.
And so being able to conceptualize like, oh, if we build this thing and we're like in one-on-one conversations with people that might want to use the product and like they kind of understand how it works or they're kind of interested in using it, how does that translate to like a huge audience of people? And I think that sort of aspect of product market fit I saw for the first time.
So you mentioned one-on-one conversations with people. What is the value of doing user research?
There's a bunch of different ways of thinking about it. I think one that's really been formative for me is the difference between quantitative and qualitative, like understanding of how people use things, right? So like here's like the sort of like basic heuristic, right? It's like if you have a question, right? We'll take the example of a couple of different questions and try to understand how you might try to ascertain the answer to that, right? The first question is like, what's your favorite color, right?
I would say blue.
Yeah.
Probably.
So what is the favorite color? Like if you had to ask people, what's their favorite color, right? Well, you wouldn't ask like 5 people. You'd ask like everybody in North America and then like everybody in Europe. Like you'd have a massive sample size
To get the data.
right? To understand that question. It's like 63% of people think blue is the best color. If you ask 5 people, you're not going to get the answer to that.
Yeah. You might get 0 if you only ask 5 people.
Exactly. And if you got 0, you wouldn't conclude that blue is not the favorite color. You'd be like, we just talked to 5 people that like green. Now let's compare that with a different question, which is I put a door in front of you with a small circular rotating thing on it. And you're like, get to the other side of this thing. How many people do you need to test that doorknob before you know whether it's a good design or not, or whether you've got the answer or not? Like 1, right? If the first person's like, they can't get to the other side and your door sucks, right? Like you've answered the question. This is a bad door.
Yep.
This is kind of the difference between like preferences versus utility, right? There's also a relationship between this and like qualitative and quantitative research, where a lot of the sort of stuff that we would do in terms of like, do people know how to use this product, right? Do people know how to use this thing to do the thing that we think that they might do with it? Like, it's a lot of that in person. It's like, complete this task, right? And if you have a sample size of 5 people and they don't all get it, like, you got to understand why. And those situations, right? I think things like in-person research is super important because you can ask questions in between the main question that you asked, right? Where if you just tried to sample a ton of people, if you didn't ask the right question, you just like would miss all of that stuff, right?
So how did you design your user research team and sessions, or how do you recommend somebody do that?
My main heuristic was when you start hearing the same things over and over again, you have a next person in your session, you're asking them questions. If you like know what they're going to say, probably a good time to stop, pick up your pencils, make a new iteration of it, and then run that back through until you start hearing the same thing over and over again.
So you keep asking different questions in different ways and they keep saying the same thing and telling you the same thing?
Well, if you have like a prototype for something, right? And you're like, how does this work? Right? Or like use this thing or do this thing. Yep. And you talk to 5 people and they're like, well, I'm having a lot of problem with like this one part of it. Right? Like probably after like 5 or 6 people, you're like, yeah, we gotta do something about this part of it. Like people don't know how this thing works. Right? Where if you didn't ask about that thing, if the one person that you were talking to was like, I don't understand this thing, you're like, well, let's double click on that. Like what's going on there, right? If you just do quantitative stuff, you just gloss over stuff like that. You gloss over the questions you didn't ask, and the questions you didn't ask, some of those might be more important than the questions you did ask, right? And you have to ascertain that. And so another way of putting it is that in the sort of breakdown between qualitative research and quantitative research, the qualitative side is valuable for like hypothesis generation. It's like we talked to 10 people and like 7 of them said this thing. We think that a lot of people might be experiencing this, right? And so let's try to solve this because it might solve the problem for a bunch of people.
So any examples, like maybe products at Robinhood that came out of interesting user research sessions?
I mean, I think a lot of it did.
Really?
Yeah. Okay.
How did you know what to prioritize? Like because I mean, I think today, I think I saw a stat, Robinhood has like 5 products at over 100 million in revenue or something. That those numbers might be wrong, but it was like, you have a lot of features that do things for people. How did you prioritize what to do?
I don't know that there was like one consistent prioritization that was applied across the board, mostly because like the company went through a lot of different stages and it's kind of, over the course of over a decade, right? I think one thing that we did do that I kind of always felt that we did do is we were very open-eyed about like, we're always a pretty small company, at least in the early days. And so the resource constraints like made so you couldn't like parallel path everything.
I think another question that kind of want to ask that's come out of all of this is like, how much do you value creativity in design? And like, how do you pull that out when you're in a startup, you're resource constrained, you're trying to run a business, be profitable, make money, but you still want to value good design and be creative?
I think creativity is relevant for design. I think creativity is like a very broadly applied thing. I think design is one of the places where it's really, really conspicuous, but like creativity is in this, we're not building a consumer product with Aetherflux, for example, but I think there's a lot of creativity in what we do.
Yeah.
And the creativity comes in like, what if you could do it this way? Or like, I was thinking about this for a while and like, I don't know if this is the right idea or not, but like, let's talk about it. Right. I think creativity comes, at least for me, I mean, I talk out loud a lot. I think out loud. It comes from pressure testing ideas. Right. And like being able to articulate an idea when it's pretty fragile. And like kind of coming back to stuff a little while ago, having the confidence to be like, you know what? I'm not gonna give up on this if it doesn't look right in the beginning, but I'll sort of take that feedback and kind of think about it a little bit more, iterate on it a little bit more. I think creativity is like, said differently, I think that there's a bit of a fallacy that there's a path independent way of thinking. Like, I think there's lots of different ways of doing things, right? And like, if you don't believe that there's lots of different ways of doing things, you sort of like inherently don't look for the creative way of doing it, right? Because you kind of think there's one way of doing it.
Yeah, so you never question the current state. I actually have one last question. You've got a ring with a cat on it. Someone told me there's like some significance between Robinhood and cats. What's the significance?
I really like cats.
You just like cats.
I love
okay.
cats. Yeah.
Do you
I'm
have-
super duper allergic to them?
But so do you have any cats?
I do. I have 2 cats.
And you're super allergic. So you just
Super
like
duper allergic.
medicate up, or you just constantly on allergy
We
medicine?
have outdoor cats.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. But I was very, very allergic to cats. We had, back in the early days of the companies before Robinhood, there were always cats living in our office.
Okay.
And it was, I mean, like the way immune responses go, right? Like you get more allergic as time goes by.
Oh, do you?
Oh yeah.
I didn't know this.
Oh yeah. And so like I was allergic to cats in the beginning, but by the time, let's say
10 years in.
holy cow, I'm super allergic to cats.
Okay.
So I live vicariously through my jewelry
Okay.
of cats.
So what makes cats so awesome? Because my daughter is also obsessed with cats. Like what makes cats so cool to you?
I think it's possibly the smuggest mammal.
I can see that.
Yeah, I think if you want to get something that's more smug than a cat, you've got to like birds are very smug. Like I think you gotta start venturing out of the mammals.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So you like smug animals.
I like cats because they're smug. I don't know if I like, for example, I find sort of venturing outside of animals, I find for example pineapples to be very smug. It's a very pointy fruit, right?
Yeah, I could see. And they're very like spiky, like the shell is spiky, and then like the taste is like it'll really get you.
Exactly, right. I don't really care for pineapples, so it's more of a cat specific thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. So how can people, I guess, just like find you, follow along what's going on with Aetherflux? Like, what should people do?
I think probably best way is to give me a follow on X. So,
on Twitter. We'll throw it
Twitter.
in the show notes.
Yeah.
And then website, aetherflux.com. People
That's
want to check
right.
it out. We'll also throw that in. Well, cool. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for
doing it.
having me. This was awesome. Yeah.
And thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please leave a quick review or comment wherever you're listening or watching. Make sure to check the show notes for more on the topics mentioned throughout the conversation. And if you don't want to miss a future episode, subscribe to my newsletter, The Split, to get each episode plus the transcript emailed directly to your inbox every week. Thanks again for listening. See you in the next episode.
Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.